"Forget you ever came here," Cora Thatcher whispered, and the words cost her something she could not name, something deep and vital, torn from a place she had been protecting for years. She stood in the doorway of the Millhaven Sheriff's office, the late afternoon sun cutting hard and orange across the dusty floorboards, her traveling bag clutched against her chest like a shield. Her eyes were dry because she had made a decision to be dry-eyed 300 miles ago on a rattling stagecoach, and she had not broken that promise to herself yet. "Forget I ever came through this town. Forget my name. Forget my face, please." Deputy Timothy Ralston sat very still behind the sheriff's desk, his hands flat on the surface, as though he needed the solid wood to anchor him to the earth. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to know when something extraordinary was standing in front of him and being squandered by circumstances that should have been different. He looked at Cora Thatcher, at the desperate set of her jaw, at the fear she was wearing like a traveling coat, and something shifted in his chest with a permanence that alarmed him. "That," he said quietly, "is the one thing I cannot do." The silence that followed was enormous. It filled the room from the rough-hewn walls to the low ceiling, and it pressed against both of them like a living thing. Cora's fingers tightened on her bag. "You do not understand what you are saying." "Maybe not," Timothy said, "but I understand what you are asking, and the answer is still no." She stared at him. Then she turned and walked back out into the dying light of a September afternoon in 1882, and Timothy Ralston pushed back his chair and followed her, because some decisions make themselves before the mind has finished reasoning through them, and this was one of those. 3 weeks earlier, Cora Thatcher had been someone entirely different. Or rather, she had been trying very hard to become someone entirely different, which is not the same thing at all. She had grown up in Galveston, Texas, the second daughter of a freight merchant named Harold Thatcher, who had built a respectable life out of determination and river trade, and who had died of a fever when Cora was 20, leaving behind a business with debts he had carefully hidden from his family. Those hidden debts were Cora's first real education in the truth that people construct elaborate versions of themselves to show the world, and that the gap between the construction and the reality is often where the most dangerous things live. She was 24 when she boarded the stagecoach in San Antonio, heading north and west because west was where people went when they needed to become someone new, when the old version of themselves had become too tangled in obligation and threat to survive. Her dark auburn hair was pinned under a plain bonnet. She wore a gray traveling dress that was good quality but not conspicuous. She carried a single bag and a small reticule with enough money to last 3 months if she was careful, and she had a plan, which was to reach a town far enough from San Antonio that no one would know her name. The plan had been working reasonably well until the stagecoach wheel cracked outside of Millhaven, New Mexico, and the driver informed his 4 passengers that they would be delayed for at least 2 days while he sent for a replacement part from the nearest trading post. Millhaven in the fall of 1882 was a town of about 400 souls, growing steadily because of the cattle trade and the railroad spur that had been promised for the following spring. It had a main street of perhaps a dozen businesses, a hotel called the Cattleman's Rest, 2 saloons, a church, a schoolhouse, and a sheriff's office staffed by Sheriff Harlan Goss, who was 62 years old and had a bad knee from a horse kick that had never healed properly, and his deputy, Timothy Ralston, who had held the job for 3 years and done it well enough that most of the town had long since forgotten he was supposed to be the junior officer. Cora checked into the Cattleman's Rest, paid for 2 nights, and intended to keep entirely to herself. She ate supper at the small table in her room, she read by candlelight, and she told herself that she would be gone before anyone had the chance to learn anything about her. What she had not accounted for was the man named Denton Briggs. Denton Briggs had been following Cora since San Antonio. She had known it since Abilene. He was not following her in a way that anyone else would have noticed, because he was skilled at the particular art of patient, invisible pursuit, and it was a skill he had developed over years of work that she did not want to think about too carefully. He rode a gray horse, and he wore a brown coat, and he kept himself just far enough behind the stagecoach that he was simply another traveler on a long road. Cora knew who had sent him. His name was Victor Stroud, and he was the man she had been engaged to for 8 months before she discovered that his profitable import business in San Antonio was built on something that had nothing to do with legitimate commerce. Victor Stroud moved things across the border that should not have been moved, and he used people who should not have been used. And when Cora had confronted him with what she had found in his private study, he had looked at her with an expression of absolute cold calculation, and told her very gently that she needed to think carefully about what she intended to do with that information. She had spent one sleepless night thinking about it, and then she had taken the documents she had copied from his study, the ones that documented enough of his operation to put him in a federal prison, and she had packed her bag and left before dawn. She had sent a copy of those documents to a federal marshal's office in Dallas, and she was carrying a second copy with her, because Cora Thatcher had not survived her father's hidden debts and 2 years of managing the subsequent financial chaos without learning something about the importance of redundancy. Victor Stroud wanted those documents back. He wanted Cora back, too, in the sense that he wanted her somewhere that he could control the situation, which was the closest thing to wanting a person that a man like Victor Stroud was capable of. He had sent Denton Briggs to retrieve both. On the second evening of the stagecoach delay, Cora was crossing the street from the general store to the hotel when she saw Briggs's gray horse tied outside the first saloon. She stopped walking. Her heart performed a violent rearrangement of itself inside her chest, and then she made herself breathe, made herself think, made herself assess. Briggs was inside the saloon. He had found her. The stagecoach would not be ready until tomorrow morning at the earliest. She could not run on foot. She had no horse of her own. She had approximately 11 hours to figure out what to do, and she needed help from someone who had authority, which meant she needed either the sheriff or his deputy. She walked to the sheriff's office. Timothy Ralston was the only one there. Sheriff Goss had gone home for supper an hour ago and would not be back until morning unless there was active trouble. Timothy was doing paperwork, the kind of dense administrative correspondence that piled up in any office regardless of the century, and he looked up when the door opened with the mild readiness of a man who was accustomed to interruptions, but had not expected this particular one. He saw a woman in a gray traveling dress, and then he saw the expression on her face and the paperwork stopped mattering. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said, rising. Cora had rehearsed this. She had decided on the walk across town what she would say and how she would say it, and she had been composed and logical and precise about it in her own head. What came out instead, when she actually stood in front of a person who was looking at her with straightforward, uncomplicated concern, was something rather different. "There is a man in your town who has been sent to bring me back somewhere I do not intend to go," she said. "I do not want to involve your office in something complicated. But I am alone, and I do not have a horse, and the stagecoach is not ready until morning, and I need to know whether there is somewhere safe I can be tonight." Timothy Ralston looked at her for a long moment. His dark eyes moved over her face with a careful attention that was not intrusive but was very thorough. He was the kind of man who had learned to read situations quickly because his survival and other people's survival had sometimes depended on it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Cora Thatcher. And the man following you, ma'am, has he threatened you directly?" "Not yet. He is very patient. That is what makes him dangerous." Timothy nodded slowly. He reached for his hat on the peg by the door. "All right, Miss Thatcher. Let us start with finding out who this man is and what he is doing in Millhaven." This was not what Cora had planned. She had planned to be given a quiet room somewhere, to survive the night, and to be gone on the morning stage with no one the wiser. Having the deputy conduct an active investigation was the kind of thing that created attention and records and complications, which was exactly what she did not want. "I would rather you did not approach him," she said quickly. "I would rather simply be somewhere he cannot find me tonight." Timothy paused with his hat halfway to his head. He looked at her again with that same careful attention. "You are frightened," he said, not as an accusation, simply as an observation. "I am practical," Cora said, which was her way of saying yes. He put his hat on. "I will be discreet," he said. "But I do my job, Miss Thatcher, and my job right now is figuring out what kind of trouble is sitting in the saloon on my main street." She followed him because there was nothing else to do, and because she was realizing that Deputy Timothy Ralston was not going to be redirected by logic or by plan. He was going to do what he thought was right, which was simultaneously frustrating and, if she was honest with herself in the way she tried always to be, rather extraordinary. They crossed the street together in the early evening dark, and Timothy was as good as his word. He went into the saloon and he looked around with the easy, unhurried manner of a man making a routine check, and he came back out 2 minutes later and told Cora that there was a man in a brown coat on a gray horse who had given his name to the bartender as Carter Webb, and who was drinking slowly and asking questions about the stagecoach schedule. "Carter Webb," Cora said. "That is not his real name." "No," Timothy agreed. "I did not think it was. He studied the dark street. Come with me. There is a woman named Ruth Alderman who keeps a boarding house on the east side of town. She is trustworthy. You will be safer there than at the hotel, because the hotel is the first place a man tracking a traveler would look." Cora almost argued. Then she made a decision, which was the same kind of decision Timothy had made earlier, the kind that bypasses the machinery of deliberation and comes from somewhere more fundamental. She trusted him. She did not entirely understand why, since she had known him for approximately 20 minutes and she had recently and conclusively proven that her judgment about men was not infallible. But she trusted him, and she nodded, and she went with him. Ruth Alderman was a widow of about 50 who smelled of lavender soap, and had the particular quality of absolute unruffled competence that Cora had spent years trying to cultivate. She asked no questions beyond the practical, showed Cora to a small clean room on the second floor, and informed Timothy that she would lock the downstairs doors at 9 o'clock, and that anyone who came knocking after that hour would hear about it from her at considerable volume. "I appreciate it, Ruth," Timothy said. "You would have done the same for any of my guests," she said firmly, which seemed to be her way of saying they did not need to discuss it further. Standing at the door of Ruth's boarding house, about to go back to the sheriff's office for the night, Timothy looked at Cora with an expression she could not entirely decode. "I will check on you in the morning," he said. "Do not leave this room for anything unless Mrs. Alderman herself comes to get you." "Deputy Ralston," Cora said. "Yes." She wanted to say something that would prepare him for the reality of her situation, something that would communicate the depth and complexity of what she was running from without actually telling him the details that would put him in danger. She was very good with words in most circumstances. They failed her now. "Be careful," she said instead. He smiled then for the first time, and it changed his face in a way that Cora noted and then firmly told herself to stop noting. "That is generally the advice I give to others," he said. "But thank you." She heard his boots on the steps as he descended, and then the front door closing, and then Ruth Alderman's heavy key turning in the lock below, and then she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the small clean room and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of being afraid. She was very precise about the 5 minutes. When they were done, she took out the copy of Stroud's documents from the lining of her traveling bag where she had sewn them, checked that they were intact, and then she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark with her eyes open and made plans. She did not sleep much, but she did sleep some. In the morning, everything went wrong in a different way than she had expected. Denton Briggs, who called himself Carter Webb in Millhaven, was not a patient man by nature. He was patient by training, by professional necessity, but 3 days of riding behind a stagecoach had worn at his natural temperament, and he had drunk a little more whiskey than was strictly professional the night before. And when he woke up and started asking around town about a woman traveling alone, he was less careful than he should have been. He found the hotel first, as Timothy had predicted. When Cora was not there, he went to the stage office and asked about passengers, and the stage agent, a friendly, talkative man named Pete Gorman, who had no reason to be suspicious of a stranger asking about travel schedules, mentioned that there had been a woman who had been helped to a boarding house by the deputy. Ruth Alderman heard the knock on her front door at 8 in the morning, before Timothy had come as promised, and she recognized immediately that the man standing on her porch was the kind of man whose knock she did not want to answer. She had been married to a good man, and she knew the difference between good and not good with the accuracy of long experience. She went to the back stairs instead of the front door, and she went up to Cora's room and knocked quietly, and when Cora opened the door she said simply, "There is a man at my front door. The deputy's office is 2 blocks west." Cora was already dressed. She picked up her bag. "Thank you," she said. "The back door goes to the alley," Ruth said. "The alley runs north. West is to your left at the end of it." Cora went quickly and quietly through the back door and down the alley, and she was halfway to the sheriff's office when she heard behind her the particular sound of someone moving with purpose in a contained space, the specific unhurried rhythm of a man who is very confident he is going to catch what he is after. She did not run. Running was visible, and it was loud, and it communicated vulnerability in a way that could make certain men more determined. She walked faster instead, and she turned west out of the alley and onto the side street, and she was at the sheriff's office door when Denton Briggs came around the corner behind her at a distance of about 40 feet. She pushed the door open and went inside. Timothy Ralston was there. He had arrived early. He looked at her face as she came through the door, and he was immediately on his feet. "He is behind me," she said, "about 40 feet. Timothy did not ask questions. He moved to the door and stepped out onto the boardwalk, and Cora heard from inside the office the following exchange, which was brief and remarkably quiet. "Morning," Timothy said. A pause. Then, "Morning, deputy. You looking for something in particular on this street?" Another pause, longer. "Just taking the morning air." "Millhaven is a fine town for that," Timothy said pleasantly. "You are staying at the saloon, Mr. Webb. I believe I saw you there last evening." "That is right." "Good. We like our visitors to be comfortable. You staying long?" The silence that followed had a specific texture to it, the texture of a man revising his approach. "Not long," Briggs said finally. "I expect I will be moving on today." "Safe travels," Timothy said. The footsteps retreated. Timothy came back inside and closed the door. He looked at Cora with a measured expression that told her nothing and everything. "That gives us a short window," he said. "He is not going anywhere, but he will be more careful now. Tell me what is actually happening, Miss Thatcher, because I cannot help you properly unless I know what I am dealing with." Cora sat down. She had spent the night deciding how much to tell him, and she had arrived at the conclusion that the only version of the truth that would serve either of them was the complete one. She told him about Victor Stroud. She told him about the documents. She told him about the night she had spent copying them by lamplight in Stroud's study while he slept down the hall, and about the pre-dawn escape with her bag and her carefully preserved evidence, and about the copy she had mailed to the federal marshal in Dallas. She told him about Denton Briggs and what she understood of his purpose and his methods, and she told him about the 6 weeks of careful travel that had brought her to Millhaven on a stagecoach with a cracked wheel. Timothy Ralston listened to all of it without interrupting. He sat across from her with his elbows on his knees and his dark eyes fixed on her face, and he listened with the quality of complete attention that Cora had very rarely encountered in anyone, the kind of listening that makes the person speaking feel that every word is being received and weighed and treated with respect. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "The documents you have with you," he said. "They are in your bag now. In the lining, she said. Yes. Where are you trying to reach? Santa Fe, eventually. I have a cousin there. I thought if I could get far enough that Stroud could not reach me before the federal case moved forward, I would be safe enough. Timothy nodded. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the quiet morning street. Cora watched the line of his shoulders and noticed that he had the kind of stillness that was the opposite of inaction, the kind that was actually very active thinking wearing a calm exterior. The morning stage is not going to work, he said. Briggs will be watching it. He cannot take you off a stage in front of witnesses in a town where the deputy already knows his face, but he will follow the stage and he will find an opportunity on the road. He turned around. What I can do is write a wire to the federal marshal's office this morning and establish that they know you and those documents are here, which gives you some legal protection. I can also arrange an escort to Santa Fe that does not look like an escort. Cora stared at him. Why would you do any of that? He looked at her directly. Because it is the right thing, he said, and because you came to me for help. Something shifted inside Cora's chest, something she recognized as dangerous and set aside firmly. Deputy Ralston, what I asked you to do last night was considerably less than this. I asked for a safe room. I did not ask you to involve yourself in what is essentially a federal situation with a man who is employed by someone with significant resources and possibly significant connections. No, Timothy said. You did not ask me to. I am offering. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light through the office window put a particular quality of shadow on his face, honest and serious, and she thought, in an entirely different situation, rather appealing. You could be putting yourself in danger, she said. That is generally the nature of this job, he replied. Over the next 2 days, while the stagecoach wheel was repaired and Timothy sent his wire and made his arrangements, something happened between them that neither of them planned, and that proceeded with the particular inevitability of things that are right even when the timing is entirely wrong. It started with conversation, because they were both people for whom conversation was the primary means of understanding the world and their place in it. Timothy brought her supper from the hotel dining room the first evening, eating it across from her in Ruth Alderman's sitting room, while Ruth ostentatiously occupied herself with needlework in the corner and pretended not to listen. He asked Cora about Galveston, about what it had been like to grow up near the water, about her father's freight business and what she had done after he died. She told him honestly, including the difficult parts, the months of managing creditors who had not known they were creditors until suddenly they were, the sale of assets, the decisions made under pressure that she sometimes reviewed in the quiet hours and found she had made correctly and sometimes found she was not sure about. He listened and he asked good questions, the kind that moved the conversation forward rather than redirecting it toward himself. But she asked him questions in return because she was genuinely curious and because, she admitted to herself, she liked the sound of his voice when he was talking about things that mattered to him. He had grown up in Kansas, he told her. His father had been a farmer. He had come west after the war, though he was young enough that the war itself had only been a presence on the edges of his early childhood, a shape of absence in the community rather than something he had experienced directly. He had done several different things before ending up in law enforcement, including a year of cattle work that he described with a rueful precision that made her laugh, and a season driving freight that had confirmed for him that he was better suited to work that involved at least occasional human interaction beyond the back end of a mule. Why a deputy? She asked. He considered the question seriously, which she had learned was his way. Sheriff Goss offered me the job, he said, and it turned out to be something I was good at and something I believed in. That is a rarer combination than it sounds. It is, she agreed. What were you going to do in Santa Fe? He asked. Beyond being safe, I mean. What was your plan for after? It was a question no one had asked her yet, possibly because everyone she had encountered since leaving San Antonio had been either a stranger with no interest in her interior life, or someone too enmeshed in the immediate practical situation to think about the future. It caught her off guard, and she answered honestly before she had time to construct something more polished. "I was going to find work," she said. "I can manage accounts. I learned the freight business well enough that I understand double-entry bookkeeping and the practical side of logistics. There is always work for someone who can make numbers tell a coherent story." She paused, "and I was going to find out whether I was the kind of person who can build a life from nothing because I have never been entirely sure." "You are," Timothy said quietly. She looked at him. "You have known me for 2 days." "Yes," he said, "and I have been watching you manage a frightening situation with remarkable composure and practical intelligence. I am fairly confident in the assessment." Ruth Alderman dropped her needlework and bent to retrieve it, and neither of them looked at her. But the color in Cora's cheeks was something she was aware of and could not entirely attribute to the warmth of the sitting room. On the second day, Timothy came in the afternoon with news. The wire to the federal marshal's office had produced a response. The case against Victor Stroud was already further along than Cora had known. Her first set of documents, the one she had mailed from San Antonio, had reached Dallas and had been forwarded to a federal agent in Santa Fe who was building a case and had been looking for precisely the kind of corroborating evidence that she carried in the lining of her bag. "There is an agent named Hargreave in Santa Fe," Timothy said. "He knows you are coming. He is expecting you and those documents." Cora exhaled. The relief was physical, a loosening in her shoulders and throat that she had not realized how tightly she had been holding. "That helps significantly," she said. "There is more," Timothy said, and something in his tone shifted. "I had a conversation this morning with Denton Briggs, or Carter Webb as he is presenting himself." Cora went still. "You confronted him?" "Conversationally," Timothy said. "I invited him to come by the office and he came, because refusing the deputy's invitation in a town you are trying to move through quietly is not something a professional man does. I told him that his inquiry about stagecoach passengers had been noticed, and that we had a particular interest in the safety of travelers passing through Millhaven. I did not mention you by name. I did not need to." He paused. "He left town this morning." "He will be on the road," Cora said immediately. "I know. Which is why I have arranged the escort I mentioned. My cousin rides between here and Santa Fe regularly on buying trips for the family cattle operation. He left this morning with 3 hands, and they are good men, and they will take a route that is not the main stage road, which is a longer way around but considerably more secure." He met her eyes. "You would be traveling with them in a wagon. It would look like a family group on a commercial trip." Cora absorbed this. "You have done a great deal," she said carefully, "for someone who did not have to do anything. I told you why. You told me it was because it was right and because I asked. Those are good reasons." She paused. "Are there any others?" The afternoon light in Ruth Alderman's sitting room made something very honest of the expression on his face. He looked at her steadily, with the directness that she had come to understand was fundamental to him, not a performance of honesty but simply the way he was. "Yes," he said, "there are others." And then he said nothing more, because Ruth Alderman came in with a tea tray and the moment passed, and they both let it pass because neither of them was in a position to do anything with it, and they both knew it. She was leaving in the morning. He was staying because Millhaven was his responsibility and his home. The gulf between those two facts was not something that could be bridged by an afternoon conversation in a boarding house sitting room, no matter what was happening in the air between them that Cora could feel with a specificity that was both wonderful and cruel. That evening, she said what she said at the door of the sheriff's office. She had gone to thank him properly. She had found the words on the walkover, arranging them carefully, and they were good words, genuine and warm and gracious, the right words for what he had done for her. And then she had stood in the doorway and looked at him sitting behind his desk with the last of the afternoon light across his hands, and the words she had prepared dissolved, and what came out instead was this: "Forget you ever came here," she said, meaning. "Do not remember my name when I am gone. Do not carry any of this with you. Do not let the complicated shape of my situation settle in your life after I have left it, because I know what I am asking you to carry on my behalf, and it is not a small thing." And he had said, "That is the one thing I cannot do." She walked back out into the evening. He followed her. They stood on the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office with the lantern light from the window falling in a narrow strip between them, and Cora turned to face him. "You are going to remember all of this," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said simply. "And when I am gone, you will think about it, and that is not fair to you." "Let me be the judge of what is fair to me," Timothy said. "Deputy Ralston, Cora." It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it and felt it simultaneously, the two perceptions arriving together in a way that left no space between knowing and feeling, and it undid several of the careful structures she had built inside herself over the past 2 days to keep an appropriate distance from what was happening between them. "I am leaving tomorrow morning," she said. "My situation is a long way from resolved, and even when it is resolved, my life is going to be built somewhere else, and your life is here, and I am not a woman who invests in things that cannot be what they need to be. I have seen what that does to people." "That is all true," Timothy said. "And it does not change the fact that I cannot forget you, because some things leave a mark whether you want them to or not, and I have enough self-knowledge to recognize this as one of them." He looked at her with his characteristic directness, nothing hidden, nothing performed. "I am not asking you to stay. I am not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that when you get to Santa Fe and you get yourself sorted out, and you build your life there, there is a deputy in Millhaven who is going to be aware that you exist in the world, and who is going to find that awareness a fine thing." The particular ache of something real and good and wrongly timed was not new to Cora. But it had never been quite this sharp before. She put her hand out. He took it, and his grip was warm and steady, and said nothing and everything. "Thank you, Timothy," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name too, and she watched him receive it. "You are more than welcome, Cora," he said. "Travel safely, and send word when you reach Santa Fe." She said she would. She walked back to Ruth Alderman's boarding house in the September dark, and she did not look back, and she told herself that the fact that she wanted very badly to look back was simply a symptom of stress and proximity and gratitude, which were things that people confused for other things in difficult situations, and that by the time she reached Santa Fe, she would have enough perspective to see it clearly. She did not believe a word of it. She left with Timothy's cousin, a stocky, good-natured man named Jacob Ralston, the following morning at first light. There were 3 cowhands with the wagon, all of whom were politely incurious about the additional passenger, and addressed her as ma'am and asked no questions. They took the northern route, a longer way that added 2 days to the journey but kept them off the main stage road, and they saw no sign of Denton Briggs. Cora reached Santa Fe on a Thursday in late September and went directly to the federal agent's office. Agent Hargreave was a thin man of about 45 with a gray beard and an air of organized intelligence that she found immediately reassuring. He received her documents with careful professionalism, examined them, and confirmed that they were exactly what his case had been missing. He told her that the legal process would take some months, but that it was now substantially complete, and that her cooperation had been noted and would be communicated appropriately. He also told her that Denton Briggs had been identified as a known associate of Victor Stroud, and that there was a federal warrant being prepared that would, when executed, make it considerably less safe for Briggs to continue his current employment. He expected the warrant within 3 weeks. "What about Stroud himself?" Cora asked. "His arrest is imminent," Hargreave said. "Within the month, I expect. He does not know how much we have, and men who do not know how much the government has tend to make decisions that accelerate the process." He looked at her across the desk. "You will need to be available for testimony in the spring. A federal court hearing will be scheduled. "Can you remain in Santa Fe?" She said yes. She found her cousin, a woman named Eliza Marsh, who had married a Santa Fe businessman and lived comfortably in a house near the plaza. And Eliza received her with the warmth of family and the practical generosity of someone who understood that people sometimes needed a place to land without excessive explanation. Santa Fe in the fall of 1882 was a city of perhaps 4,000 people, older than any Anglo settlement in the region, built around a central plaza with adobe buildings that absorbed the light differently than anything Cora had grown up with. She found it beautiful in a severe and specific way. She found work within 2 weeks, doing accounts for a hardware merchant named Calloway, who had discovered that his books were a consistent source of confusion, and who was deeply relieved to find someone who could untangle them. She sent word to Millhaven, as she had promised. She wrote to Timothy Ralston in care of the sheriff's office, a short and properly restrained note that told him she had arrived safely, that the federal situation was proceeding, and that she was grateful for everything he had done. His reply came in 3 weeks, and it was not short, and it was not restrained in the way that a carefully managed professional communication would be restrained. It was a letter from a person to another person, thoughtful and warm, and full of the particular quality of his voice that she had spent 6 weeks telling herself she did not actually remember as precisely as she did. He told her about Millhaven in October, about the cattle drives that were finishing and the town settling into its winter rhythm. He told her about a situation he had handled the previous week involving a dispute over water rights between 2 neighboring ranchers, and the way he described it made her both laugh and think, because he had found a solution that was fair to both parties without requiring anyone to lose, and that kind of thinking was not common. He asked about Santa Fe. He asked what the work was like, and whether the city suited her, and whether she had found anything there that felt like beginning to belong. She wrote back at length. Their correspondence became a regular thing, a letter every 2 weeks, sometimes more often. It was not a declared thing, not acknowledged by either of them as being something other than the natural continuation of an unusual connection between 2 people who had briefly shared a difficult situation. But it was, in fact, something else, and they both knew it, in the way that you know a thing before you have the words for it or the circumstances to say it aloud. Victor Stroud was arrested in San Antonio in November, 12 weeks after Cora had left. The news reached her through Agent Hargreave, who sent a brief formal note, and through Timothy's letter, which arrived 3 days later and had a warmth and relief in it that made her understand that he had been carrying that particular concern on his own behalf for the entire time without mentioning it. Denton Briggs was arrested the following week, attempting to cross into Mexico. The threat that had been following Cora for 300 miles folded up and disappeared, and she sat in Eliza's comfortable sitting room on a Tuesday evening and understood that she was, for the first time in 8 months, genuinely safe. She should have felt only relief. She felt relief, and under it, something else that she had been managing for months, and that was now, in the absence of immediate danger to direct her energy toward, considerably harder to manage. She wrote Timothy a letter that was longer than usual. She told him about the arrests and what that meant for her situation. She told him about the federal testimony that was now scheduled for April, and about the work with the hardware merchant, and about Santa Fe in November when the light changed, and the air came down from the mountains cold and clear, and the city smelled of pinon smoke. And at the end, because she was an honest person, and because the months of correspondence had built something between them that the honesty was owed to, she wrote, "I think about Millhaven more than is reasonable, for a town I was in for 2 days. I believe what I actually think about, though we should perhaps both pretend I have not said this, is the conversation on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office." She sent the letter before she could rewrite it into something safer. His reply took 10 days, which was longer than usual, and she spent those 10 days telling herself that she had misjudged, and that the boardwalk conversation had meant something different to him than it had to her, and that this was fine and she was a woman who could handle fine. When his letter arrived, she read the first sentence standing at the door with the post still in her hand. "I have read your letter 4 times," he wrote, "and each time I find it more clearly says what I have been trying to say for 4 months in the careful way that people say things when they are not sure they have the right to say them directly. I believe I have the right now. I would very much like to come to Santa Fe if you will have me." Cora sat down on the nearest chair, which happened to be the one by the front window, and she read the rest of the letter, and then she read it again, and then she went to find Eliza and told her that she needed paper and pen. Timothy arrived in Santa Fe 2 weeks before Christmas, having arranged with Sheriff Goss for a week's leave. He came by train to Albuquerque, and then by stage the remaining distance, and Cora was at the stage depot when he arrived, because she had decided that being composed about this was a fine aspiration but not necessarily practical. He came down from the stage and he saw her immediately, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the small distance of the depot yard, 2 people who had built something real over months of paper and ink seeing each other in 3 dimensions for the first time since September. He crossed the yard to her. He was wearing the same coat she remembered or one like it, and he carried a single bag and he looked like himself, which was a thing she had been uncertain about, whether the person in the letters would match the person in the memory. He matched exactly. "Cora," he said. "Timothy," she said. And then he smiled the way he had smiled that first night in the sheriff's office, the smile that changed his face, and the careful composure she had put on that morning with her good dress was absolutely insufficient, and she was glad of it. They walked through Santa Fe in the December cold, and he bought her coffee at a shop near the plaza, and they talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say, which Cora had known would be the case but which was still, in the experience of it, remarkable. He told her more about Millhaven and the winter situation with the ranches and the way Sheriff Goss's knee was giving him genuine trouble, and what that meant for the town's long-term law enforcement situation. She told him more about the hardware merchant and the accounts, and about Eliza and the connections she had made in Santa Fe, and about what the federal testimony preparation involved. And underneath all of this, running like a current under the surface of a quiet river, was the thing they were actually doing, which was being in each other's presence and discovering that every instinct that had developed over months of correspondence was correct and was, if anything, understated. On the second day of his visit, they walked to the edge of the city where the land opened up and the mountains were visible, and Timothy said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am asking it honestly and that there is no version of an honest answer that will be the wrong one." Cora looked at him. "Ask. Do you intend to build your life in Santa Fe?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it considerably over the past weeks, with a particular attention since the arrival of his letter. "I could," she said. "The work is good and the city suits me and there are reasons to stay." She paused. "But I do not feel finished with the question yet. I am not certain Santa Fe is the specific place, as distinct from simply the place where I landed safely." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains with the clear-eyed way he looked at things that mattered. "Millhaven is going to need a real sheriff within the year," he said. "Goss's knee is not going to get better. The town council has been talking to me, and I believe they are going to offer me the position." He turned to face her. "That is not a proposal of any kind. I want to be very clear about that. It is context. It is me telling you where my life is, because I think you have the right to know the whole shape of it." "That is a remarkably careful way to have this conversation," Cora said. "Yes," he said. "I am a careful man." A pause. "Most of the time. And the other times." He reached out and took her hand, which was not careful, which was the simplest and most direct thing he could have done, and which said everything that the careful conversation had been building toward. "I have been in love with you," he said. Since approximately the 3rd day of October, when your first letter arrived and I read it twice before I had taken off my coat, and I understood that whatever the complications of geography and circumstance, the thing that had started in Millhaven was not something I was going to be able to simply be sensible about. Cora looked at their joined hands and then at his face, and she made no effort to be composed about any of it. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since the evening on the boardwalk when you said that forgetting me was the one thing you could not do, because no one has ever said anything that careful and that true to me in my entire life." The December mountains were very clear and very quiet, and Timothy Ralston kissed her in front of them with the straightforward earnestness of a man who has been waiting for the right moment with considerable patience, and has absolutely no intention of being indirect about it now that the moment has arrived. She kissed him back with equivalent conviction. The spring came with its complications and its resolutions. Cora testified at the federal hearing in April, giving her account with precision and clarity, producing the documents that had been carefully preserved through their entire journey. Victor Stroud's defense made an attempt to paint her as a vengeful former fiancé with a personal motivation, and Cora answered every question with the kind of calm that came from having survived things that were considerably more frightening than a defense attorney's skepticism. The case was decided in the government's favor. Stroud was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Denton Briggs received 3 years as an accessory. Agent Hargreaves shook Cora's hand outside the courthouse and told her she had done the government a considerable service, and she thanked him with genuine warmth and went to find the telegraph office to send a wire to Millhaven. Timothy had come down for the hearing, staying at a hotel near the plaza for the week. He was in the telegraph office when she arrived, having already wired Millhaven with the result because he had been watching through the courthouse window. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was accurate," Cora said, "which is the same thing in a courtroom." He laughed, and she thought, not for the first time, that his laugh was one of the better sounds she had encountered. That evening at dinner, at a restaurant near the plaza where they had eaten several times over the winter, Timothy placed a small package on the table beside her bread plate. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine, which was not romantic in the traditional sense but was very much him. Inside was a ring. It was not an extravagant ring, because Timothy Ralston was a man who earned a deputy's salary, but it was a carefully chosen one, a narrow band of gold with a small turquoise stone that was a specific and thoughtful response to the month she had spent in New Mexico, where turquoise was woven into the culture and the landscape in a way that she had come to find genuinely beautiful. "I spoke to Eliza last week," he said. "She told me you had been wondering whether Santa Fe was where you wanted to stay or whether it was simply where you had been safe." Cora looked at the ring and then at him. "She told you that. She is forthright," he said. "I found it helpful." He met her eyes with the directness she had been reading for 8 months and learning with increasing precision. "I want to ask you properly. I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to come to this honestly, which means I want you to know that I am asking because this is what I want, and not as a solution to a geographic problem, and not because the timing of the court case makes it convenient, and not for any reason other than that I would like to spend the rest of my life being a person you can talk to and who can talk to you, and I think that is a good enough reason." "It is an excellent reason," Cora said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely a yes." He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which she later discovered was because Eliza had given him the circumference of one of her own rings that was close in size, and he had been precise about it with the jeweler, which was exactly the kind of thing he would do. They were married in Millhaven in June of 1883, on a Saturday morning when the high desert air was still cool, and the whole town had found reason to attend, because Timothy Ralston had 3 years of good service invested in this community, and people came out for the ceremonies of people they trusted. Ruth Alderman was there, wearing her best dress and crying in an entirely unself-conscious way that Cora found she loved her for. Sheriff Goss was there, his bad knee doing him enough trouble that he had a cane, but not enough to keep him from the front pew. Jacob Ralston, who had driven the wagon to Santa Fe, stood up with his cousin as best man and delivered a toast at the small reception afterward that was brief and sincere and made Cora laugh. Eliza Marsh came from Santa Fe with her husband. Timothy's parents had come from Kansas, an elderly couple who were quiet and warm and who received Cora with a formal kindness that she understood as the warmest thing they knew how to do. She wore a cream-colored dress that Eliza had helped her choose, and she carried a small bunch of desert flowers that Ruth Alderman had gathered that morning from the edges of the town, where the wildflowers came in with the summer. And she stood in the Millhaven church and said her vows to Timothy Ralston, and found that there was nothing complicated about any of it, that this was simply the truest thing she had done in a life that had had its share of difficult truths, and that the simplicity of it was part of what made it true. They set up house in a small frame house on the south end of Millhaven's Main Street, 2 blocks from the sheriff's office. It had been occupied by a family who had moved on to a homestead farther west, and it needed some work, which Timothy applied himself to with the methodical competence he brought to everything, and which Cora helped with in ways that were sometimes practically useful, and sometimes more enthusiastic than skilled, but were always accompanied by opinions that he found valuable and said so. She took on accounts work for 3 businesses in Millhaven, because her organizational capabilities were genuine and the town had need of them, and because she was not a woman who intended to be idle. The hardware merchant, a man named Forsyth who had been keeping his own books with increasing desperation, was particularly grateful. So was the hotel, whose owner, Mrs. Cartwright, had been managing her establishment's finances with more courage than methodology, and was relieved to have someone who understood what a ledger was supposed to do. Timothy was appointed sheriff in August, as the town council had indicated he would be, and he took the office with the same steadiness he brought to everything. He hired a deputy, a young man of 22 named Cole Addison, who was earnest and teachable, and whom Timothy trained with a care that Cora observed with considerable respect, because she understood that he was passing on not just the technical skills of the job but a whole approach to it, an approach grounded in fairness and attention, and the belief that people generally deserve the benefit of being treated as capable of better. In the first winter of their marriage, they were very happy in the specific, daily way that is harder to describe than dramatic happiness, but considerably more durable. They ate breakfast together every morning, which was where the best conversations happened, before the day's demands had accumulated, and in the particular honesty of early morning. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people with formed opinions and the willingness to express them, and their disagreements were conducted with the same directness that characterized the rest of their communication, and they were generally resolved by the end of the day, because neither of them had any interest in carrying a grievance past its natural span. Cora discovered things about him that she had not known in the months of letters and the visits, that he read more widely than she had expected, that he had strong feelings about the management of the town's water resources that led him to spend considerable time working with the county authority on that issue, that he was more musically inclined than he had ever mentioned, that he had a small guitar which he played in the evenings sometimes when he thought she was occupied with her accounts, and which she found she could hear from the other room with a warmth that was out of proportion to the sound of it. Simply because it was him. He discovered things about her. That she baked bread with a commitment that was as much about the process as the product, that she had very precise opinions about the organization of any shared space, that she was good at communicating in ways that did not feel like criticism, that she corresponded with a breadth of people. Her cousin Eliza, a woman from Galveston she had known since childhood, Agent Hargreave who sent her an occasional professional update, and that the way she managed those relationships, maintaining warmth and substance over distance, was a skill he admired with a specific admiration because he had seen how it was done, through the months of letters between them. In the spring of 1884, Cora told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast over coffee in the direct way she had of telling him important things. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something was significant. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "More than entirely." The smile that followed was the best version of the smile she had been cataloging since the sheriff's office in September of 1882. Their son was born in October of 1884, in the Millhaven house, with a midwife named Mrs. Henley, who had delivered approximately half the town's children and managed the process with brisk competence. They named him Daniel Harold Ralston, the Daniel for Timothy's father and the Harold for Cora's, and he was a healthy, loud, entirely unreserved person from his first moments, which suggested that, whatever the genetic contributions of each parent, he had received the more expressive of the available options in full measure. Millhaven grew steadily through the mid-1880s. The railroad spur came through in the spring of 1885, which changed the town's economy and population, and created new demands on Timothy's office that he managed by expanding it, hiring a second deputy, and establishing a clearer set of formal protocols for the town's legal framework than it had previously had. The town council asked him to serve on a commission looking at the region's water rights, the issue he had been attending to for 2 years, and he did, and the work he put into it resulted in an agreement that resolved a dispute that had been generating low-level conflict for 5 years, which was the kind of work that does not make dramatic stories, but that matters considerably to the people whose lives it affects. Cora's bookkeeping work expanded with the town. She took on the railroad freight office's accounts when they established a local presence, which was a significant contract, and required her to take on an assistant, a young woman named Frances Doby, who had come to Millhaven with her family on the railroad, and who was quick and accurate, and whom Cora trained with the same care that Timothy brought to training Cole Addison. Daniel learned to walk in the yard of the South Street house, and then to run and then to follow his father to the sheriff's office on Saturday mornings, when Timothy caught up on correspondence, sitting under the desk with a wooden horse that Jacob Ralston had carved for him, and occasionally emerging to offer opinions on whatever was being discussed, which his father received with the seriousness due to any party expressing a view. In the early summer of 1886, Ruth Alderman fell ill. She was 70 years old, and the illness was not the kind that improves, and Cora went to her every day and sat with her, reading to her, or simply talking, or sometimes simply being present in the way that the people we love need us to be present when the hard things come. Ruth died on an afternoon in July with Cora beside her and the window open to the summer air, and Cora arranged her affairs, because Ruth had no living family and had told Cora where everything was and what she wanted done, and Cora did it precisely as Ruth had asked, which was what Ruth had known she would. The grief she felt was genuine and not small. She had not expected, when she arrived in Millhaven as a frightened woman in a gray traveling dress, to find someone who would matter to her in the permanent way that Ruth Alderman had come to matter. But the unexpected connections are often the truest ones, and she honored the grief by letting it be what it was. Timothy understood. He held her the evening after Ruth's funeral and said nothing, because he had learned precisely when words were the right thing and when they were not, and this was one of the occasions when his presence was the thing, and the words were beside the point. Their second child was born in February of 1887, a daughter they named Clara Ruth Ralston, the Clara from a grandmother on Timothy's mother's side, and the Ruth because it was right, and because they both knew it. She was a different person from the beginning than her brother, quieter in her initial presentation, but with an observational quality that Cora recognized, because she had it herself, the the kind of watching before speaking that people sometimes mistake for reticence, but is actually something closer to thoroughness. Daniel was delighted with her in the possessive, bewildered way of small children confronting a sibling, and then genuinely interested in her. Once it became clear, she was going to develop into someone who could look back at him. And by the time Clara was a year old, they had achieved a working relationship based largely on Daniel's willingness to bring her things and Clara's willingness to examine them with every evidence of appreciation. The house on the South Street acquired a garden that was Cora's project in the way the Water Rights Commission was Timothy's, an ongoing work that had a purpose beyond itself, that was about having something growing and tended, about the investment of care in a particular piece of earth. She grew vegetables because they were practical, and also flowers because she had learned somewhere along the way that practical and beautiful were not in competition, that there was room for both if you organized the space thoughtfully. In 1888, Victor Stroud was released from federal prison after serving 6 years of his sentence, reduced for conduct. Cora learned about it from Agent Hargreave, who wrote her a careful letter informing her of the date and noting that Stroud's operations had been permanently dismantled by the prosecution and that his resources were significantly diminished. He was, Hargreave wrote, unlikely to be in a position to cause her further trouble, but he wanted her informed. She told Timothy that evening. He listened to the whole of it, and then he said, quietly and with a precision that was not threatening but was very clear, "If he is foolish enough to come anywhere near this family, he will find that the situation has changed considerably since San Antonio." "I know," Cora said. "You are not afraid of him," Timothy said. "It was an observation, and it was correct. I was afraid of him when I was 24 and alone, and the only thing between me and him was a cracked stagecoach wheel and a deputy I had met for 20 minutes, Cora said. "I am not 24 and alone now." She saw something in his face at that, something warm and protective and proud, not proud of her in the condescending way, but proud the way people are proud of the lives they have built together, of the specific accumulation of choices and commitment that turns two separate people into something that is genuinely one thing. Victor Stroud did not come near Millhaven. He moved to St. Louis and eventually into an unremarkable life that she heard nothing further about, which was the right amount of information. The chapter closed. 1889 brought the territorial politics that had been building in New Mexico since before Cora arrived, the sustained push toward statehood, and the internal arguments about how that would be organized. And Timothy's work on county governance made him a person whose opinion was sought in those conversations. He went to Albuquerque in March to attend a territorial convention as Millhaven's representative, and Cora managed the household and her accounts work, and the children with the competence that was simply her mode of being. And when he came home after 10 days with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been in too many rooms with too many people talking at each other, she made him dinner and let him sit in the quiet of his own house and be restored by it. She had always understood that home is a thing two people make together, not a building or a location, but a quality of presence and intention, and she brought that understanding to Millhaven, to the South Street house, to the daily life she and Timothy had constructed together out of the materials of character and circumstance. Daniel started school in the fall of 1889, attending the Millhaven schoolhouse that now had 2 teachers because the town had grown enough to require them. He was a good student in the subjects that interested him, which were primarily the ones that involved stories and the ones that involved numbers, and a less dedicated student in the subjects that did not, which his teacher, a patient woman named Miss Forthright, handled with the practiced diplomacy of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. Cole Addison, Timothy's first deputy hire, had grown into a genuinely good lawman, and in 1890 he married a woman named Patience Wheeler who had come to town with the Methodist Church's new pastor, and who had the specific practicality of someone who had decided what kind of life she wanted, and was constructing it with clear intention. Cora liked her immediately, and they became friends in the straightforward way of women who respect each other's intelligence and find each other's company genuinely interesting. The spring of 1891 brought Cora's cousin Eliza to visit from Santa Fe, the first time they had seen each other since the wedding, though they had corresponded consistently. Eliza's husband had sold his Santa Fe business, and they were traveling before deciding on their next residence, and they spent 2 weeks in Millhaven, which gave Cora considerable pleasure, because Eliza was a person of substance and warmth, and Timothy liked her immediately, which was the result Cora had expected but was glad of. Over dinner on the second evening, Eliza looked at the house and the children and the life that had assembled itself around the couple at the table, and she said with characteristic directness, "You look exactly right." "Right for what?" Cora asked. "Right for yourself," Eliza said. "You look like a person who is exactly where she belongs." She paused. "You did not always look like that." Cora thought about the woman in the gray traveling dress on the stagecoach from San Antonio, tight with held-in fear and careful calculation, carrying her evidence in the lining of her bag, and trying to become a different person in a hurry. She thought about the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office and the thing that had been said there, the thing she had asked for and the thing she had received instead. "No," she said, "I did not always look like that." Timothy was looking at her from across the table with the dark eyes she knew as well as her own now, with the specific quality of attention that was still, after 8 years, the thing she trusted most in the world. He said nothing, because this was a moment that did not need his words, but she felt the fullness of what he was not saying, and she received it completely. In the fall of 1891, Cora discovered she was expecting again. She told Timothy at breakfast as she had the first time in the same direct way. He reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Surprised," she said, "and very pleased." "So am I," he said, "on both counts." Their third child, another son, was born in June of 1892. They named him James Theodore Ralston, the James for no one in particular, but because it suited him from the first day, and the Theodore because Timothy had a fondness for the name, and Cora had decided she did too. He was a calm baby in a way that Daniel had not been, which Cora received with gratitude, and he had the turquoise blue eyes that occasionally appeared in Timothy's family like a recessive visitor from some earlier generation. Daniel, who was 7 by then, took the arrival of a second sibling with more equanimity than he had taken Clara's arrival, having learned by now that siblings were a permanent feature of his landscape and were best approached with cooperation. Clara, at 4, was fascinated with the baby in a proprietary way that suggested she considered him primarily an addition to her own collection of interesting objects, and she transferred to him the same careful, serious attention she brought to everything else. Millhaven by 1892 was a town of nearly 1,000 people, and Timothy's office had grown accordingly. He had 3 deputies by then, and he had worked with the county to establish a more formal court structure, and the town had a proper jail and a proper courthouse, and all the apparatus of a functioning legal community in a territory that was still, in certain respects, working out what it intended to be. He managed it all with the steadiness that was fundamental to him, and the people of Millhaven trusted him with the specific confidence of a community that has seen a person do difficult things well over a long period of time. Cora's accounts business had become, by this point, something rather larger than a local bookkeeping service. She had Francis Doby working with her full-time, and 2 part-time additional workers, and she handled the financial records for 12 businesses in Millhaven and 3 more in neighboring towns, and she had begun teaching a small bookkeeping class at the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons for women who wanted to develop the skill. Miss Forthright had organized the class and Cora had been recruited for it, and she found that teaching suited her in ways she had not anticipated, because explaining something precisely enough for another person to understand it requires you to understand it very clearly yourself, and clarity was something she had always valued. The Friday class eventually expanded, and then it became an unofficial part of the school curriculum, and then it became a formal course that drew students from across the county, and Cora found that she had built something she had not planned, and that it gave her a satisfaction that was its own distinct thing from the other satisfactions of her life, the satisfaction of a specific contribution to the options available to women in this particular community. She thought sometimes about the injustice that had been so normal for so long, the assumption that women's financial lives were managed by the men around them, that economic understanding was not a thing women needed. She had been 20 when her father died, and she had discovered in the chaos of the estate that the assumption of someone else's management was a liability that could become catastrophic. She had decided then that she would never be economically dependent on someone else's competence or honesty, and it was a decision that had saved her in San Antonio and had given her the independence to choose Millhaven and Timothy freely, without need as the dominant factor. The class was, in part, her way of giving other women access to the same choice. Timothy understood this about her, had always understood it, and he supported it with the practical investment of someone who believed in what he was supporting, not as a concession or as indulgence, but as a recognition of something important. He told her once, in the particular directness of their early morning conversations, that one of the things he most respected about her was that she had never waited to be given permission for anything that mattered. "I did wait once," she said. "I stood at your door and asked you to do something for me. You did," he said, "and I said no. You said no to the wrong part," she said. "You said no to forgetting me." "Yes," he said. "That is the part I said no to. And the rest of it," she said, "the safe room and the escort to Santa Fe and the wire to the federal marshal. That was not you waiting to be given permission," he said. "That was you identifying a resource and using it effectively." She laughed. He smiled. Daniel came in wanting breakfast, and the conversation redirected itself into the morning. And that was how it was, the large and the small living together in the same space, the serious and the daily woven through each other in the pattern that is what a life actually is, rather than what it looks like from the outside. In the spring of 1894, New Mexico was still a territory, the statehood question still unresolved, the political argument still grinding along in the complex way of things that involved too many competing interests. Timothy had been appointed to a territorial law enforcement advisory board, which required him to travel to Santa Fe 4 times a year for meetings, and Cora sometimes came with him when the children could be left with Patience Addison, who had 2 children of her own by then, and managed all of them with the same methodical serenity she brought to everything. Santa Fe in 1894 was considerably larger than it had been in 1882, and Cora found it interesting to walk its streets and notice how much had changed, and how much had remained, the plaza still at the center, the adobe still absorbing the particular quality of New Mexico light, the mountains still defining the horizon with their clear certainty. She had been afraid here once, and then she had been safe here, and now she was simply visiting, which felt like the right trajectory for a place. On one of these visits, she found Agent Hargreave at the federal building, older and considerably grayer but still in his post, still possessed of the organized intelligence she had found reassuring in 1882. He shook her hand with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Ralston," he said, "I have thought often about that morning in this office 12 years ago." "So have I," she said honestly. "You built a good life," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," she said, "with considerable help." "The deputy," he said. "The sheriff now," she said. He smiled. "Yes, of course." She thought about the copy of the documents in the lining of her traveling bag, and the stagecoach with the cracked wheel, and Ruth Alderman sending her down the back stairs into the alley, and the particular quality of Timothy Ralston's voice saying that there was one thing he could not do. She thought about how completely a life can turn on a series of accidents and choices and moments of stubbornness, because refusing to forget someone is a kind of stubbornness, the best kind, the kind that insists on what is true even when forgetting would be easier. "Thank you," she said to Hargreave, "for what you did 12 years ago." "You did most of it," he said. "Yes," she said, "but not all of it." She found Timothy outside the Federal Building, where he was waiting for her in the Santa Fe Plaza. Standing in the afternoon light in the way he stood, settled and attentive, with the quality of a man who is comfortable with himself in a place. He saw her coming, and his expression did the thing it still did after 11 years of marriage, the specific thing that she had noted on the boardwalk in September of 1882 and had never stopped noticing, the thing that was not performance and not effort but simply him responding to the fact of her existence. She crossed the plaza to him. "How was Hargreave?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Old, still thorough." She stood beside him, and they looked at the plaza together, at the late afternoon activity of the city, the vendors and the travelers and the children and the dust and the long, lovely light. "He said I built a good life." "You did," Timothy said. "We did," she corrected. He put his arm around her shoulders in the easy way of people who have been doing this long enough that it is as natural as breathing, the physical language of a partnership that has been tested and maintained and continuously chosen. "We did," he agreed. They stayed that night in a hotel near the plaza and ate supper in a restaurant they had discovered on an earlier visit, and they talked over 2 hours about everything and nothing in particular. About Daniel's current interest in the mechanics of the railroad, about Clara's recent decision that she intended to be a teacher, about James, who at 2 was developing the specific focused stubbornness that suggested he was going to be a force of nature in time, and that Timothy found enormously entertaining. They talked about the advisory board and what Timothy was learning from it about territorial governance, and about the bookkeeping class and the 2 students who were particularly promising, and about the garden in Millhaven, and whether the south wall received enough light for the tomatoes she wanted to try next summer. They talked the way people talk when they have built something real together, with the fullness of knowing each other well and the continued interest of knowing there is always more to know. And the conversation moved easily between the significant and the small because both are always present in any life, and the people who understand that are the ones who are genuinely happy. Walking back to the hotel through the Santa Fe night, Cora thought about September of 1882 with the particular clarity that distance gives to things. She had been 24 years old and frightened and determined, carrying evidence in the lining of her bag and a plan that was already failing, walking across a dark street to a sheriff's office she had chosen for purely practical reasons. She had stood in the doorway and asked a man she did not know to do the one thing that would have unmade everything that followed. And he had said no, not to her safety, not to the help she needed, not to any of the things she had legitimately come for, just to the forgetting, just to the erasure of the specific fact of her. And in that refusal, in that one line spoken quietly in a dusty sheriff's office on a September evening, was the whole of everything that had come after. The letters and the ring with the turquoise stone, and the house on the South Street, and Daniel and Clara and James, and the garden and the Friday bookkeeping class, and 11 years of breakfast conversations, and the person she had become inside this life, which was more completely herself than she had ever been. She reached for his hand in the Santa Fe dark, and he took it without looking, the reflexive comfort of it, and they walked back through the plaza to the hotel. "Timothy," she said, "yes, I am very glad the wheel cracked." He was quiet for a moment with the smile she could hear in his silence. "So am I," he said, "every single day." They went back to Millhaven the following morning, back to Daniel's questions about train mechanics and Clara's earnest opinions about teaching and James's new word, which was more, used with great conviction in every applicable context. Back to the sheriff's office and the accounts ledgers, and the garden beginning to come in, and the Friday class, and the South Street house, where they had made a home out of love and intention, and the ordinary, extraordinary work of choosing each other, consistently and completely, over the length of days and years. Back to the life they had built from a cracked wheel and a gray traveling dress, and a moment of stubbornness that had been the truest thing either of them had ever encountered. The absolute, certain, unequivocal refusal to forget. And they were, in all the ways that mattered and all the ways that were quiet and daily and real, profoundly, completely, lastingly happy.